Hey, I'm Brad, and welcome back to Overkill Reviews, which is Banger's weekly metal review show. But you already know that because you're here. What you don't know is that yesterday I went back to my old university to be a guest lecturer to talk about my professional life, which is a weird statement to call me a professional because like professionals are usually like suit and ties, and I'm usually like the same jeans I've worn for the past months and a Dying Fetus hoodie. So as always, I'm here to remind you that we have a Patreon campaign. You can sign up and help support us so we can keep doing this or even make it bigger and better. And if you sign up today, last day, you get 2 patches, a Banger patch and a Lock Horns patch. Today, last day. So now that all the housekeeping is out of the way, we're going on to the review. And if you've been to a death metal or like deathcore package tour in the past like 5 or so years, chances are you've seen these guys. The new album by Fallujah, Undying Light, out now on Nuclear Blast Records. Do I say out weird? Now. Whether you have or haven't seen them live, I guarantee that they didn't get up on stage and give you their bio live, which is why I'm here. So the band formed in San Francisco, California in 2007 and started out as a little bit more of a technically inclined deathcore band before dropping the core and upping the atmosphere steadily from album to album. For this one, they lost vocalist Alex Hoffman and guitarist Brian James, opting to give the mic to longtime friend Anthony Palermo. The departing guitarist mentioned creative divergences when he left, which I can only take as they're flirting with pop punk now. So, let's go. So as I said, you probably saw these guys on death metal, deathcore package tours. To me, they were always kind of stuck in that 2 of 5 or 1 of 4 slot that was also occupied by tech death, prog death peers, Rivers of Nile. That band actually, with the last album, Where Owls Know My Name, kind of broke out of that, turning even the nayest of sayers into lovers as they produced one of the hottest albums of 2018. Honestly, it's a logical progression from 2016's Dreamless to this one, but it's only accentuated, and that's not necessarily a good thing, by the fact that they have a new vocalist. Sure, he's more dynamic within his range, but his range is up here. It doesn't really go down here. There's no death growls. So combine the added atmosphere with the lack of death growls, and it really seems like they said fuck you to death. More so than they have. Like, there's definitely death metal elements here. But like, first listen, you're like, whoa, what's happening? The focus on sparser packages doesn't work as well here as it did with Rivers of Nile, who use a little bit more of like those atypical instruments to like pique your interest. And that's not to say that you can't create compelling, progressive, technical death metal with, you know, your typical 2 guitars, 1 bass, 1 drummer, 1 vocalist lineup. Plenty of bands have. It's just the parts fall a little flat here, and they get a little bit repetitive at times. Like the rhythms just kind of keep going, and they just kind of like subtly noodle on top. But it just keeps going and going and going and going nowhere, just in circles. And I guess that highlights the problem with a lot of progressive bands. I don't really know what they're progressing to. It just seems like they're just kind of meandering. To illustrate the problems that I had with developing my opinion of this album, early listens led me to text a friend in the industry and say The Ocean Above is But then I grew to appreciate it, which is kind of indicative of the up and down nature I had while listening to this album. Speaking of up and down, we're going to the good side. So I say all of that, but this album is really not disjointed. It's got a good flow. It goes up, it goes down, and it's a pretty cohesive listen. The first song, Glass House, has this cool, stuttering prog riff, and the song Dopamine has a really interesting tribal intro. The beginning riff of Sanctuary is really quite cool, as is the gruff singing, though that does the opposite of a lot of the album's problems by disappearing too soon. Eyes Like the Sun just might be my favorite song on the album, even adding some dissonance to the leads, making it feel legitimately threatening, where a lot of the leads are almost focused on being pretty and airy, ethereal if you want to use the journalistic cliche. And since we're talking melodies, Departure has some mellow death riffing. I think overall, the second half of the album is stronger than the first. All right, so first let me set the scene for how my reviews for Banger begin. I'm sitting at my day job at Exclaim, headphones on, probably putting up contests or some shit. And I listen to the album. A lot. So it's kind of background noise, and I'm doing my job. And parts that stand out, for better or for worse, I jot down notes on them, because chances are if they pop out at me when I'm half listening, they're probably worth talking about. And of course, later I do deep dives that are more nuanced. I'm listening for the overall ebb and flow, not just the exclamation parts. But while listening for the exclamation parts, they just didn't happen. It just stayed as background music from contest to contest, email to email. Nothing really stuck out to the point where it made me stop what I was doing and write down a note, or turn to Joe in my office who writes about metal for me and say, yo, dude, this is sick. You know how earlier I said the album was cohesive? It is, but that's not necessarily a good thing. I would rather have an album that's half fire and half dirt, like Blaine said the Children of Bodom album was, than something that's kind of like, throughout the whole thing. I mean, sure, Meatloaf is a cohesive meal, but it's kind of fucking whack. I'd rather have my meat and whatever the fuck else goes in Meatloaf cooked well on their own. But I don't eat meat. It's just an analogy. Meatloaf sucked when I was a kid, it probably still sucks now. So ultimately, I think that subgenres are better when they're influenced by the components of it rather than the conglomerates that it became, which is why metalcore was better when it was influenced by metal and hardcore rather than the, at times, mainstream drivel that it has become. I also think that's why technical death metal is better when it's death metal with the technicality ramped way up. But on this album, it feels like they were influenced by another technical death metal band. So it's just kind of watered down. So this is far from the worst album. I just think that there's a little bit of a shock that comes from adding way more atmosphere to the music and adding vocals that are way more airy than powerful death shit. I think if they were changing their vocal style, they maybe should have done an album that was a little bit more in line with their last thing, so this was a little bit less of a whoa. That being said, if it was still great, I'd still recognize the greatness, and I just didn't recognize the greatness here. It's okay, and for that reason, it's getting 2.5 skulls out of 5. So, shoutout time. First up, I've got 2 albums that came out on the same day this one did, last Friday. I've got Venom Prison, their album Samsara, out on Prosthetic Records. I wrote a piece comparing them to Decapitated for Exclaim. There's also some like, old Suicide Silence, kind of high screams. So it's like some like groovy, fun death metal. Maybe a little bit of like core influence. Next up, we've got Noisem and their album Cease to Exist out on 20 Buck Spin. So a few years back, these kids were like the wonder kids, the prodigies of like the death / grind / thrash scene, landing tours with like Carcass, Black Dahlia Murder, etc. When like, I think the drummer was like 15 when their first album came out. They're not quite as young now. They lost half their lineup. They're back, I think, as a trio. They still rip. You should still listen to it. Next up, I have an EP that's coming out this coming Friday by Rhythm of Fear. It's called Ritual Dementia. It's an independent release. They're like a thrash band. They've got like almost like the timelessness of like early Metallica, but it feels modern. I can't imagine a world where these guys don't blow up. So like, hey, get in now so you can say that you listened to them before everybody else. That's what everybody wants, right? To be cool. If you want to hear about all the bands early so you can continue being cool, subscribe to us because we talk about bands a lot. What do you think? Is this Fallujah album awesome? Am I talking out of my ass? Are they better than Rivers of Nile? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks.